There is a country in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean whose name promises something its land has almost never delivered. It is called Cape Verde, Green Cape, a name that suggests lush forests, sweeping grasslands, water running freely across fertile valleys. Stand on almost any one of its 10 islands, and you will see something else entirely. Dry, rocky slopes, dust-colored valleys, hillsides where even the hardiest trees struggle to take root. For most of the year, this country wears the colors of drought: earth brown, stone gray, the pale yellow of vegetation that has learned to survive on almost nothing. The name was never a description. It was an accident, inherited from a peninsula on the coast of Senegal that Portuguese sailors passed before they ever saw these islands. A misunderstanding that has lasted more than 5 centuries and still confuses every traveler who arrives expecting the country its name seems to promise. But the deepest strangeness of Cape Verde has nothing to do with color or rainfall or the gap between a name and a landscape. It has to do with the people. Before the 15th century, there is no evidence that a single human being had ever lived permanently on these islands. Not a settlement, not a fishing camp, not a single generation raised on this volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. Cape Verde was one of the rare places on the surface of this planet with no indigenous population at all, uninhabited not because it was hidden, but because nothing about it made survival easy enough for anyone to try. Today, that once empty archipelago is home to one of the most stable democracies on the African continent, a nation whose football team played in a World Cup, a nation whose people created from nothing inherited and nothing ancestral an entirely new culture, an entirely new language, and an identity that exists nowhere else on Earth. This is the story of how a place with no history before 1462 became one of the most singular cultures in the Atlantic world. How drought, isolation, and 5 centuries of hardship produced not despair, but a philosophy of life that Cape Verdeans now export to every corner of the globe they have settled in. This is Cape Verde, 10 islands, no ancestors, and a culture built entirely from people who chose or were forced to begin again. To understand why Cape Verde looks nothing like its name, you have to look not at the islands themselves, but at the desert that lies between them and the African mainland. Cape Verde sits roughly 570 kilometers off the coast of Senegal, in a stretch of the Atlantic that lies directly in the path of one of the planet's most significant weather corridors. Many of the tropical storms that eventually become Atlantic hurricanes begin to organize in these waters, drawing their first structure from conditions that exist here before they exist anywhere else. And the wind that crosses this same stretch of ocean carries something else entirely: dust, lifted from the Sahara Desert, drifting hundreds of kilometers across open water until it settles over the islands in a faint brown haze that can turn a clear sky the color of weak tea. Geologically and climatically, Cape Verde is not a tropical paradise. It is an oceanic extension of the Sahel, the harsh semi-desert belt that stretches across the width of Africa, just pushed 200 kilometers further out to sea, surrounded by water instead of sand. Only about 1/10 of the archipelago's land can support long-term cultivation. For the people who eventually settled here, drought has never been an occasional crisis. It has been the baseline condition of life, the constant against which every harvest, every well, every decision about where to plant and where to build has always been measured. The name itself came from a mistake that history simply never corrected. Cabo Verde, Cape Verde, was borrowed directly from Cape Verde, a peninsula on the coast of what is now Senegal, marking the westernmost point of mainland Africa. Portuguese sailors passed that genuinely green cape before they ever discovered the dry volcanic islands that would eventually take its name. Whether through confusion, convenience, or simple administrative habit, the name stuck. A landscape that has spent 5 centuries failing to live up to a label it never asked for. And yet, from above, the islands carry their own kind of beauty, one that has nothing to do with the word green. 10 volcanic peaks, arranged in a rough horseshoe, the surviving high points of underwater mountains, looking from a certain altitude like the remnants of a world that sank into the Atlantic long before anyone was here to witness it. This was the land that European sailors stumbled upon in the middle of the 15th century. Empty, unforgiving, and about to become one of the most consequential meeting points in the entire history of the Atlantic Ocean. On the southern coast of Santiago Island, where a small valley opens between dry, rocky slopes facing the Atlantic, there is a town today defined by stillness. Stone-paved streets, low houses, a dry stream bed running quietly past walls that have stood for more than 5 centuries. Its name is Cidade Velha, the Old City, and it does not look, at first glance, like one of the most consequential places in the history of the Atlantic world. In 1462, Portuguese settlers founded a city here called Ribeira Grande. It became the first permanent European settlement established anywhere in the tropics, not in Asia, not in the Americas, but here, on a volcanic island that, fewer than 50 years earlier, had no human population at all. Cape Verde's position in the Atlantic placed it directly on the most critical sea routes of the entire age of exploration. Ships crossing the ocean from Europe toward Africa and eventually toward the Americas stopped here constantly to take on fresh water, to restock food, to make repairs before the long, uncertain voyages that lay ahead. Along with cargo and sailors, something far darker began passing through this harbor as well. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, Ribeira Grande became one of the major transit centers of the transatlantic slave trade. People taken by force from coastal regions across West Africa were brought to these islands as an intermediate stop, before being loaded onto ships continuing across the ocean toward the Americas. The harbor, that had once seemed like a simple stopover for water and repairs, became, for thousands of human beings, the last piece of African coastline they would ever stand on before a forced crossing they had no power to refuse. Today, the stone walls of the old fortifications still stand quietly beneath the tropical sun, weathered but intact, carrying a silence that visitors describe as heavier than the heat. This was not simply a trading post, it was a wound in the history of human movement, one that the town has never tried to hide or explain away. But Cidade Velha was not only a site of commerce and forced displacement. It was also, almost paradoxically, the place where an entirely new human identity began to take shape, born not from ancient ancestry, but from the collision of peoples who had never before had any reason to share a single piece of land. The Portuguese arrived with their own language, their own religion, their own customs, assumptions, and expectations. The West Africans who were brought here, whether through trade, forced labor, or eventual settlement, carried memories, music, survival knowledge, and oral traditions passed down across generations on a different continent entirely. Over decades, then centuries, these communities lived alongside one another, worked alongside one another, built families and households and futures on islands that 50 years earlier had belonged to no one at all. From that collision, something genuinely new emerged. A Creole language, Creole, developed as a bridge between origins that had never previously needed to communicate with each other. It was not simply Portuguese with African words mixed in. It was not African grammar borrowing Portuguese vocabulary. It was its own structure entirely, the linguistic creation of generations of people adapting in real time to a reality that had never existed anywhere else on Earth. Alongside the language, a mixed heritage community gradually formed as well, what the Portuguese called mestiço, old categories of identity, old boundaries between European and African, slowly blurred into something that belonged fully to neither side and entirely to this archipelago. It was here, in this small valley on the southern coast of Santiago, that the foundations of modern Cape Verdean identity were laid. Today, visitors can walk the same stone streets, see what is considered the oldest church in the tropics, and stand among the remains of coastal fortifications that watch centuries of arrivals and departures pass beneath them, carrying, in their silence, the quiet beauty of a heritage that time has preserved rather than erased. Cape Verde entered the 19th century facing a crisis that would reshape the destiny of the entire archipelago. As the transatlantic slave trade gradually declined under growing international pressure and shifting economic interests, the ports that had supported Cape Verde's relevance for centuries began losing the role that had defined them. Ribeira Grande, once one of the most important harbors in the Atlantic world, faded into the quiet, almost forgotten town that exists today. At the same time, the islands faced something even more severe: prolonged droughts, recurring with brutal regularity, caused devastating famines that killed tens of thousands of people across multiple crises spanning the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. These were not isolated tragedies. They were a structural feature of life on land that had never been able to reliably feed the people living on it. From this combination of hardship and necessity, massive waves of migration began pushing outward from the islands toward the United States, toward other Portuguese colonies, toward anywhere that offered even a marginal improvement over the famine cycles at home. This pattern, established in the 19th century, would come to define Cape Verdean identity as profoundly as anything that happened on the islands themselves. A people defined as much by who left as by who stayed. Out of this combination of hardship, displacement, and a growing sense of shared identity, the desire for genuine self-determination slowly took root in the Cape Verdean political consciousness. A man named Amilcar Cabral became the leading voice of this movement, advocating not just for Cape Verdean independence, but for unity between Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, two Portuguese colonies separated by ocean, but connected by the shared experience of colonial rule and the shared hope of self-governance. Cabral's ideas, and the movement he helped build, shaped the path toward freedom for both peoples, even though he would not live to see independence achieved. He was assassinated in 1973, 2 years before Cape Verde's liberation became reality. On the 5th of July, 1975, Cape Verde officially gained independence, ending more than 5 centuries of colonial administration that had begun with the founding of Ribeira Grande in 1462. A new nation was born, not from ancient sovereignty reclaimed, because no ancient sovereignty over these islands had ever existed, but from the determination of a people who had built an entire identity from nothing inherited, and who were now choosing, for the first time, to build their own future entirely by their own will. Cape Verde is not one landscape repeated 10 times. It is 10 distinct faces, scattered across the Atlantic like separate pieces of a single oceanic soul. Local tradition divides the archipelago into 2 groups, named for the winds that cross the ocean here. To the north, the Barlovento Islands, the Windward Islands, facing directly into the strongest Atlantic currents. To the south, the Sotavento Islands, more sheltered, calmer, shaped by gentler conditions. Sal, one of the best-known islands in the Barlovento group, appears from above like a strip of honey-colored land floating in deep blue water. Rainfall here is minimal, giving much of the landscape an almost desert-like character. But that same harshness created one of the island's most valuable historical resources: ancient salt pans formed by volcanic activity combined with centuries of seawater evaporation that supported local communities for generations. Today, the white salt fields still stretch across the dry land, reflecting sunlight like enormous natural mirrors. Further east lies Boa Vista, beautiful view, and the name, unlike the country's own, delivers precisely what it promises. Long beaches stretch seemingly without end. Many travelers arriving here for the first time describe the disorienting sensation of standing in what feels like a desert that happens to be surrounded by ocean. Sand dunes shift constantly under winds that carry dust across the sea from the Sahara, a visible, tactile reminder that this island sits closer, climatically, to North Africa than to anywhere most visitors would call tropical. Fogo tells an entirely different story. At the center of this island rises Pico de Fogo, a volcano roughly 2,829 meters high, the tallest peak in the entire country. From a distance, it appears as a vast black pyramid standing against the horizon, and it remains, to this day, one of the active volcanoes of the Atlantic. Modern eruptions have repeatedly reshaped the island's landscape, most significantly in 2014 and 2015, when lava flows destroyed entire villages inside the volcano's caldera. And yet, in a pattern that echoes across so much of Cape Verde's history, the people did not abandon this land permanently. They returned. They rebuilt their homes. They continue cultivating the fertile volcanic soil inside the wide caldera, where vineyards and coffee plantations still grow today, surrounded by seas of black volcanic rock that mark where their neighbors' homes once stood. Santiago is the largest island in the archipelago and the country's most important political and economic center. The capital, Praia, sits on its southern coast, carrying none of the quiet stillness found on many of the smaller islands. Government offices, universities, businesses, and the country's primary port are all concentrated here, reflecting the image of a nation still actively building its future. Santiago also preserves some of Cape Verde's deepest historical traces, from its dry interior valleys to the ancient stones of Cidade Velha. The past and present exist openly, side by side, on the same land. If Santiago is the country's administrative center, São Vicente is widely considered its cultural heart. The city of Mindelo, located here, has long been known as a cradle of Cape Verdean art and music. Seaside cafes, small public squares, and open-air stages regularly echo with the sound of morna, a deeply emotional musical tradition blending African, European, and Atlantic influences, reflecting the soul of a people who have always lived suspended between departure and return. In the northwest of the archipelago lies Santo Antão, perhaps the island that most surprises visitors who arrive expecting only the dry, brown landscape that defines so much of the rest of the country. Vertical cliffs plunge straight into the ocean. Winding roads cling to mountainsides like lines drawn carefully across ancient volcanic stone. Mist and moisture carried by sea winds allow vegetation to grow here with a strength and density rarely seen elsewhere in Cape Verde. A small, unexpected fulfillment of the promise the country's name has made and so rarely kept. The remaining islands complete the picture, each with its own particular character. São Nicolau offers a peaceful beauty with colorful villages nestled among rugged mountains. Brava, often called the Island of Flowers for its unusually mild climate and greener vegetation, sits as the smallest inhabited island in the archipelago. Maio is known for its largely untouched beaches and the unhurried rhythm of daily life found there. And Santa Lucia remains to this day entirely uninhabited, wild, protected, and almost untouched by the centuries of human settlement that transformed every other island around it. 10 islands, 10 distinct identities, all of it shaped by the same Atlantic wind and the same 5 centuries of human arrival, struggle, and adaptation. Cape Verde is not defined only by its volcanoes, its beaches, or the dry, windswept geography of 10 islands scattered across the open Atlantic. The true soul of this country reveals itself most clearly through its music, its people, and the everyday philosophy that has carried them through 5 centuries of hardship. When night falls over the streets of Mindelo, or Praia, music becomes the language that links every generation together. Among all of Cape Verde's musical traditions, morna is considered the most distinctive sound the country has given to the world. Its slow, deliberate melodies carry nostalgia, longing, and a quiet, persistent ache of separation that Cape Verdeans have a specific word for: saudade. Saudade may be homesickness. It may be longing for someone who has traveled far away and not returned. Or it may simply be the feeling of reaching towards something that no longer exists in the present moment of your life. A sensation so deeply woven into Cape Verdean identity that it has become, for many, the defining emotional thread of the entire culture. That thread is not abstract. For centuries, hundreds of thousands of Cape Verdeans left these islands in search of opportunity that drought and isolation could never reliably offer at home. Today, the Cape Verdean diaspora, concentrated heavily in the United States, particularly in New England, as well as across Portugal and other parts of Europe, is significantly larger than the population still living on the islands themselves. This is why separation remains such a powerful, almost structural theme in the nation's collective memory. Cape Verdean identity has never been only about who stayed. It has always, equally, been about who left and what staying connected to home across that distance actually requires. No single person did more to bring Morna to the world than Cesaria Evora. The woman from Mindelo often appeared on stage barefoot and unadorned, performing with a simplicity that made her global success feel almost accidental, even as her voice carried the breath of the sea, the rhythm of the harbor, and journeys stretching across generations of Cape Verdean migration. Through her, much of the world first heard the deeper emotional register of this small Atlantic nation, and recognized in her voice something that needed no translation. But the music of Cape Verde is not only slow and not only melancholic. Beneath the memory carried by Morna, another energy entirely remains just as powerful. That energy is Funana, a tradition where the accordion moves quickly, urgently, full of unmistakable life. The dance steps grow stronger. The rhythm becomes more vibrant, more physically demanding, a direct emotional counterweight to the introspective stillness of Morna. There is also Batuk, one of Cape Verde's oldest musical forms, carrying a West African heritage preserved across many generations of oral tradition. Hand claps, layered percussion, and call and response singing create an atmosphere alive with community spirit. Music made not for a stage, but for people standing close together, responding to each other in real time. Across the islands, one phrase appears almost everywhere, painted on signs, printed on t-shirts, spoken casually in everyday conversation. No stress. Cape Verde is a land that has faced drought, strong winds, and profound isolation in the middle of the ocean for as long as people have lived here at all. For centuries, its people could not control the weather. They could not control the distance separating them from the rest of the world, or the famines that distance and drought combined to produce. The only thing they could ever genuinely control was how they chose to respond to those conditions. From that singular point of control emerged a calm, practical philosophy of life. Do not rush. Do not complain more than the situation requires. Do not let circumstances beyond your control take away whatever joy remains available to you in this moment. This same spirit finds expression in another central Cape Verdean concept, Morabeza. It is often translated simply as hospitality, but the word carries more than that single English term can hold. It also means kindness, openness, a genuine, practiced ability to make others feel welcome, especially, in an environment that has never made survival easy for anyone. Morabeza is how Cape Verdeans have built relationships and community across 5 centuries in a place that offered very little margin for error. That same philosophy appears finally on the dinner table. Cachupa is the dish most closely associated with Cape Verdean national identity. A slow-cooked stew made from corn, beans, vegetables, and whatever other ingredients happen to be available, simmered for many hours until everything blends into something far greater than its individual parts. In a land where resources have always been limited, people learned, out of necessity, to make the most of everything they had. Every small ingredient carries its own value. Every meal reflects the same spirit of thrift, adaptation, and quiet resourcefulness that defines so much of how Cape Verdeans have built a life on land that never made it easy. Cape Verde in the 21st century is writing a chapter very different from the image of dry, struggling islands that defined so much of its earlier history. In numerous international rankings, this small country is consistently recognized as one of the most stable democracies on the entire African continent. Transfers of political power have taken place peacefully, repeatedly, across multiple decades, and public institutions have continued strengthening even as far larger and far wealthier nations around the world have struggled with the same basic task. Education has become one of the country's clearest national priorities. The literacy rate now sits among the higher levels in the region, reflecting sustained, long-term investment in human potential that began almost immediately after independence in 1975 and has continued with remarkable consistency ever since. In healthcare, Cape Verde reached a genuinely significant milestone when it was officially certified malaria-free in 2024, an achievement that followed years of sustained improvement to public health systems and disease prevention infrastructure across all 10 islands. This same spirit of quiet, determined progress appeared on a global stage when Cape Verde's national football team qualified for the 2026 World Cup for the first time in the country's history. Their opening match left a strong impression on football fans around the world, not because of the final score, but because it demonstrated on the largest possible stage what a nation of fewer than 600,000 people, with no natural resources beyond sun, wind, and the resilience of its own population, could accomplish when given the opportunity. Cape Verde is also pursuing a future built directly from the very forces that once seemed like nothing but natural hardship. Year-round sunshine and constant Atlantic winds, the same winds that once carried Saharan dust and crushing drought, are now being transformed into clean energy. The country has set ambitious targets to dramatically increase its share of renewable electricity in the coming years, aiming for roughly half of its total energy needs to come from renewable sources by 2030. And one resource continues to shape the nation in ways that remain largely invisible to outsiders: its diaspora. From New England to Lisbon to countless other corners of the world, hundreds of thousands of Cape Verdeans maintain close, active bonds with the islands their families left, often generations ago. The remittances they send home do more than simply support individual families economically. They form a lifeline, a continuous, living connection between these 10 islands in the middle of the Atlantic and the rest of the world their people have spent 2 centuries reaching toward. Cape Verde proves something that very few places on Earth ever get the chance to prove: that a people's identity does not always have to be inherited from thousands of years of ancient history. On islands that once had no permanent human population at all, people created an entirely new society through harmony, adaptation, and an unwavering will to rise above hardship that never fully relented. From the old harbors of Cidade Velha to the green, unexpected valleys of Santo Antão, from the haunting, aching rhythm of Morna to the Atlantic winds that have never once stopped crossing these 10 islands. Every part of this story tells the same truth. It is a story of resilience. It is a story of freedom, deliberately chosen and patiently built. A green cape that was never defined by its landscape, but entirely, completely, by the spirit of the people who decided, against everything the land seemed to argue, to make it home. We want to hear from you. If you had arrived on these islands 5 centuries ago, with no ancestors here and no history to draw on, what do you think you would have built? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes a culture always needs ancient roots to feel real. Next week, we are going somewhere that fought its own land back from disaster with nothing but seawater and refused to lose. We will be there. We will see you there.